Keir Starmer's leadership is on the verge of collapse. A political earthquake has struck, and the aftershocks are growing stronger by the hour. A damning investigation aired on live television has exposed a £4 million donation funneled into the Labour Party's coffers from a hedge fund based in the Cayman Islands, one of the world's most notorious tax havens. The revelations have sent shockwaves through Westminster, leaving Starmer scrambling to salvage his credibility. But here's the real kicker. This isn't just about money. The source of the funds ties Labour directly to industries they have spent years condemning: fossil fuels, private healthcare, and arms manufacturing. The hypocrisy is staggering, and the public is furious. How can a party that parades itself as the champion of working people accept millions from corporate elites hiding their money offshore? How can Starmer, who built his entire leadership on transparency and integrity, now stand in front of the British people with a straight face? The backlash has been swift and unforgiving. Within minutes of the exposé, social media erupted, with #StarmerOut and #LabourCrisis trending across the country. Labour supporters, those who once saw the party as the last bastion of integrity against conservative corruption, are now left wondering if they've been deceived all along. The pressure on Starmer is immense. His political survival now hinges on a near impossible task: convincing the public that this is nothing more than a misunderstanding. But is it? Because when he finally stepped in front of the cameras for an emergency press conference, it was nothing short of a disaster. His body language betrayed him: shaky, defensive, visibly rattled. When grilled about Labour's financial dealings, he dismissed the allegations as misleading and politically motivated. But was that enough? Not a chance. If anything, his response fueled even more speculation. If there's nothing to hide, why does he look like a man desperately clinging to power? And then, there's the real nightmare for Labour: this scandal isn't happening in isolation. At the very same time, the party is scrambling to contain the fallout from the disgraceful resignation of Labour MP Mike Asbury, who stepped down after being convicted of assault. Asbury's exit was already a major blow, but in the wake of the £4 million funding scandal, it now feels like the beginning of something much bigger: a total collapse of trust in Starmer's leadership. Labour is no longer just facing a crisis, it is staring down the barrel of political catastrophe. But let's talk about the money, because that's where this scandal truly explodes. The £4 million donation didn't just come from any hedge fund. It came from one deeply entangled in industries that Labour has spent years attacking. This is the same party that preaches about environmental responsibility, yet they've taken money with direct links to fossil fuel investments. The same party that claims to fight for the NHS, while accepting funds from private healthcare interests. The same party that opposes Britain's military-industrial complex, now bankrolled by a fund tied to arms manufacturers. The hypocrisy is so brazen, so absolute, that even Labour's staunchest defenders are struggling to spin it in their favour. And here's where it gets even worse. This isn't just a question of optics, it's about trust. For years, Labour has painted itself as the moral alternative to the Tories, branding the Conservative Party as corrupt, elitist, and beholden to big business. But now, with these revelations, that image has been shattered. If Labour is willing to sell out its principles so easily, then what's left? What exactly does the party stand for anymore? The answer that's forming in the minds of many former Labour supporters is chilling: nothing. The fallout is spreading like wildfire. Within the party, fractures are deepening. Some MPs are rallying around Starmer, desperately trying to downplay the scandal, insisting that the donation was legal and that the party must stay focused on the next general election. But others, especially those on the left of the party, are seething. They see this scandal as a fundamental betrayal of Labour's core principles, an unforgivable breach of trust that could cost them everything at the ballot box. The whispers of internal rebellion are growing louder. Labour's unity is crumbling, and Starmer's grip on power is slipping. What happens next? That's the question on everyone's mind. Because Starmer is running out of options. He could try to ride out the storm, hoping the public moves on. But with a general election looming and trust in politicians at an all-time low, can he really afford to take that gamble? Every second that Labour fails to provide a clear and honest response, the anger intensifies. Every time Starmer dodges questions, the suspicion grows. Every moment he clings to power, the calls for his resignation grow louder. And if you think this is bad, understand this is just the beginning. The scandal is still unfolding. More details are emerging by the hour. More questions are being asked that Labour is failing to answer. What exactly did Starmer know about this donation? Who approved it? Were there any conditions attached? And perhaps the most explosive question of all, are there more secret financial deals waiting to be exposed? Because if this £4 million is just the tip of the iceberg, then Starmer is facing something far worse than a leadership crisis. He's staring at the complete destruction of his political career. The stakes couldn't be higher. Labour is bleeding credibility at a time when it can least afford to. Reform UK and the Conservatives are circling like vultures, ready to exploit every misstep. The by-election triggered by Mike Asbury's resignation has now become a full-scale battleground, a test of whether Labour can still hold on to its traditional voters or whether disillusionment will drive them into the arms of political insurgents. So, what happens now? Does Starmer step aside before he takes the entire party down with him? Or does he dig in, fighting a losing battle as his reputation and authority crumble before the nation's eyes? One thing is certain, this scandal is not going away. The public is demanding answers. The media is relentless. His own party is turning against him. And the clock is ticking. Starmer's leadership is hanging by a thread, and unless he finds a way to turn this around, fast, he may not be leading the Labour Party for much longer. The question is, will he go willingly? Or will he be forced out in disgrace? Keir Starmer is facing the most turbulent days of his leadership, and the situation is spiralling out of control. As if the £4 million scandal wasn't enough to send Labour into a tailspin, now a fresh disaster has erupted, one that cuts even deeper into the party's already crumbling credibility. Labour MP Mike Asbury has resigned in disgrace after being convicted of assault, adding yet another humiliating stain to the party's reputation. The timing couldn't be worse. With a critical by-election on the horizon and Reform UK circling like a pack of wolves, the party now faces a crisis so profound that it threatens to shatter Starmer's leadership altogether. For a party that has built its image on integrity, social justice, and moral superiority over the Tories, Asbury's resignation is nothing short of catastrophic. It's not just about one MP stepping down, it's about the symbolism, the optics, and the message it sends to voters who are already furious over the funding scandal. Labour, which has spent years lambasting the Conservatives over issues of misconduct and ethical failings, now finds itself drowning in its own hypocrisy. How can they claim to be the party of accountability when their own MPs are embroiled in disgraceful scandals? How can they attack the sleaze of their political opponents when they are busy covering up their own? The fallout is immediate and devastating. Starmer's leadership was already teetering on the edge after the exposure of Labour's secret financial ties to a hedge fund with connections to fossil fuels, private healthcare, and arms manufacturing. That scandal alone shattered the trust of Labour's grassroots supporters, many of whom have started questioning whether Starmer's version of the party has completely abandoned its core values. But now, with an MP resigning under a criminal conviction, the party is bleeding credibility at an even faster rate. The problem isn't just Asbury's disgrace, it's what it represents. It's a reflection of a Labour Party that is riddled with internal dysfunction, where scandal after scandal is pushing supporters to their breaking point. If Labour was in a strong, stable position, this resignation would be a blow, but not a death sentence. But in the current climate, it's an unmitigated disaster. This is a party in freefall, a party whose leader is losing control by the day, a party that no longer seems capable of governing itself, let alone the country. And then there's the political reality. This resignation has triggered a by-election at the worst possible moment for Labour. The seat, once considered safe, is now up for grabs, and Reform UK knows it. The party, led by Richard Tice and fueled by the lingering influence of Nigel Farage, has been waiting for an opportunity like this. They've long struggled to break through into mainstream politics, but now, with Labour self-destructing before the nation's eyes, they see their chance. Reform UK is positioning itself as the true alternative, not just to Labour, but to the entire political establishment. And thanks to Labour's incompetence, they now have a real shot at making history. The stakes of this by-election could not be higher. If Labour loses, it will send shockwaves through Westminster. It will be undeniable proof that the party is hemorrhaging support, that Starmer is no longer seen as a credible leader, and that Reform UK is a serious threat. Even if Labour manages to cling to the seat by a narrow margin, the damage will have been done. The mere fact that Reform UK is even competitive in a traditionally Labour stronghold speaks volumes about how disillusioned voters have become. And what will that say about Starmer's ability to lead the party into a general election? If he can't secure his own MPs and his own seats, why should the country trust him to take on the Tories? Inside the Labour Party, the panic is setting in. Behind closed doors, meetings have turned into shouting matches. Some MPs are still trying to put on a brave face, insisting that the party can weather this storm. But others are beginning to whisper what was once unthinkable: Starmer must go. The cracks are turning into fractures. The moderate wing of the party, the faction that once backed Starmer as a safe pair of hands, is now questioning whether he has what it takes to lead Labour to victory. The left-wing faction, which has long distrusted him, sees this as their moment to push for change. And Starmer, caught between both sides, is running out of moves. The press can smell blood in the water. Every major outlet is now covering the crisis, and the headlines are brutal. The media, which once gave Starmer the benefit of the doubt, is now openly questioning whether he can survive much longer. And the Conservative Party? They are watching gleefully from the sidelines, knowing that Labour's collapse could be their saving grace. Even in their own moment of crisis, with Rishi Sunak struggling to hold his party together, the Tories understand one thing: if Labour is tearing itself apart, they don't even need to win, Labour will lose on its own. But what does Starmer do now? The obvious move would be damage control, acknowledge the crisis, take decisive action, and reassure the public that he is still in command. But that's not what's happening. Instead, he's retreating. His allies are doubling down, insisting that this is nothing more than media exaggeration, that the resignation of an MP is just a blip, and that the £4 million scandal is a non-issue. This strategy isn't just failing, it's making things worse. The public isn't buying it. Labour voters aren't buying it. Even Labour MPs aren't buying it. Asbury's resignation has not only created a political vacuum in his constituency, but it's also exposed the deeper rot within the Labour Party itself. It has forced an uncomfortable question to the forefront: is Starmer really fit to lead? Because right now, it doesn't look like it. Every day that passes, his authority weakens. Every new revelation chips away at his legitimacy. Every poll that shows Labour slipping is another nail in the coffin. And if Labour loses the upcoming by-election? That might just be the final straw. Because at that point, the whispers of rebellion won't just be whispers anymore, there will be open calls for Starmer to step down. The party is already on edge, desperate to hold itself together, but if it suffers an electoral defeat at the hands of Reform UK, the backlash will be immediate and brutal. Labour MPs who have been hesitant to criticise Starmer in public will suddenly find their voices. Figures within the party who have been waiting in the shadows will see an opportunity to challenge him. And the public, already disillusioned, will take it as confirmation that Labour under Starmer is a sinking ship. Starmer's leadership is in crisis. The party is divided. The voters are losing faith. And with every passing day, the walls are closing in. This isn't just about a scandal. This isn't just about an MP resigning. This is about the future of the Labour Party itself. And right now, that future has never looked more uncertain. Keir Starmer's leadership is crumbling before our very eyes. The once confident, composed Labour leader now finds himself trapped in a political inferno that is spreading faster than he can contain. Every hour that passes brings a new revelation, a new betrayal, a new nail in the coffin of his tenure. The party that was supposed to be preparing for a triumphant march towards Downing Street is instead devouring itself from within. This is no longer just a crisis, it is an existential threat to Labour's future. Starmer is losing control, and the people who once stood beside him are now running for the exits. In Westminster's corridors of power, whispers of discontent have turned into open discussions of his downfall. Key Labour figures are meeting in secret, weighing their options, calculating whether the time has come to push him out before he drags the entire party into electoral oblivion. These aren't just minor backbenchers looking to make a name for themselves, these are influential MPs, figures who once backed Starmer as the man who could cleanse Labour of its past failures and lead them back to power. Now, those same allies are quietly making phone calls, exploring alternatives, and preparing for what feels increasingly inevitable. The cracks in Starmer's authority are no longer just visible, they are gaping chasms that threaten to swallow him whole. And the worst part? His own MPs see it too. The internal fractures within Labour are no longer deniable. The party's left-wing faction, which never trusted Starmer in the first place, is seeing an opportunity to seize back control. Meanwhile, the centrists, the so-called moderates who rallied behind him, are now panicking. The man they believed to be a steady hand is proving to be anything but. His inability to get ahead of the crisis, his failure to take decisive action, and his growing unpopularity with the public are turning him into a liability. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, another financial scandal has exploded onto the scene, leaving Starmer even more exposed. New reports suggest that the £4 million donation that initially rocked the party might not be the only questionable financial transaction lurking beneath the surface. Investigative journalists are now probing deeper, uncovering a web of financial ties that raise even more uncomfortable questions about Labour's true backers. Where else has Labour's funding come from? How many more offshore accounts and shadowy donors have helped bankroll Starmer's political machine? And most damning of all, what influence did these donors expect in return? The irony is brutal. Starmer built his entire leadership on a promise of transparency, accountability, and integrity. He positioned himself as the man who would clean up Labour's image, who would restore trust in the party, who would distance himself from the ethical failings of previous leaders. And yet here we are, watching his leadership consumed by the very scandals he once condemned. This is a betrayal that Labour supporters are not willing to forgive. Social media has turned against him, once loyal activists are disillusioned, and the public's patience is wearing thin. And let's be clear, this isn't just about Starmer. This is about the party itself. Because what we are witnessing is not just the potential downfall of one leader, we are watching a full-blown collapse of Labour's credibility. The public isn't just questioning Starmer's integrity, they are questioning the entire party's ability to govern. If Labour can't even manage its own internal chaos, if it can't even handle its own financial affairs, if it can't even keep its own MPs in line, then why should the British people trust them with the country? Labour MPs are in full-blown survival mode. Those who once pledged allegiance to Starmer are now prioritising their own political futures. Constituency chairs and party activists are growing restless, demanding answers, pressing for change. The sentiment is shifting from "can Starmer recover?" to "who should replace him?" And once that question starts circulating seriously, there is no turning back. But what does Starmer do? Instead of taking bold action, instead of making a decisive move, he hesitates. He deflects, downplays, and denies. His most recent public appearances have done little to inspire confidence. His once polished delivery has been replaced by nervous defensiveness. His attempts to regain control have only exposed his own weaknesses. Every time he dodges a question, every time he dismisses concerns as media hysteria, he only adds fuel to the fire. The opposition is taking full advantage. The Conservative Party, battered as it may be by its own internal struggles, now has the perfect distraction. Rishi Sunak and his allies have wasted no time capitalising on Labour's self-inflicted wounds, framing the party as untrustworthy, unstable, and riddled with hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Reform UK is seizing the moment with ruthless efficiency. Nigel Farage may not be directly involved in this fight, but his political legacy is alive and well, and his movement is gaining ground. The by-election triggered by Asbury's disgraceful resignation is now looking like a referendum, not just on Labour's ability to hold on to its seats, but on Starmer's ability to lead. If Reform UK manages to make a significant dent in Labour's vote share, or worse, if they pull off an outright victory, it will send shockwaves through Westminster. It will confirm what is already becoming painfully clear: Labour is in freefall, and Starmer is powerless to stop it. Even a narrow win for Labour will be seen as a humiliation, proof that they are losing their grip on the very voters who once formed the backbone of their movement. So now, the question isn't whether Starmer's leadership is in danger, it's how long he has left. His MPs are abandoning him. The public is losing faith. The opposition is smelling blood. The media is digging deeper. And with every passing day, the walls are closing in. Does Starmer have the strength to fight back? Or will he be forced out by the very people who once propped him up? One thing is certain, this crisis is far from over, and the worst may still be yet to come. The Labour Party is teetering on the edge of disaster. What should have been a routine by-election has transformed into an all-out battle for political survival. Keir Starmer's leadership, already battered by scandal after scandal, now faces its ultimate test. The voters are heading to the polls, but this isn't just about one parliamentary seat anymore. This is about the direction of the country, the trust in Labour, and whether Starmer can hold on to the last shreds of his authority. Reform UK, once dismissed as a fringe movement, has seized the moment with ruthless precision. They are no longer just an anti-establishment protest party, they are a real political force, gaining momentum by the day. Labour's implosion has gifted them an unprecedented opportunity, one they are determined to exploit. Disillusioned voters from both Labour and the Conservatives are flocking to them, desperate for an alternative to what they see as a political class drenched in hypocrisy, dishonesty, and self-interest. Starmer and his team know exactly what's at stake. Losing this by-election would send a devastating message that Labour is no longer the default choice for working-class voters, that their grip on key constituencies is slipping, that Starmer's leadership is failing. The panic inside Labour HQ is palpable. Their campaign, once steady and confident, has descended into chaos. Last-minute strategy meetings, frantic messaging changes, desperate attempts to claw back public trust, it all reeks of fear. Labour strategists are scrambling to paint Reform UK as dangerous, as unfit to govern, as a reckless gamble for discontented voters. But the problem? That argument isn't sticking. Voters are tired of hearing the same scaremongering tactics from the establishment. Labour's warnings are falling on deaf ears. The more they try to demonise Reform UK, the more they look like they are deflecting from their own catastrophic failings. And the polls? They paint an alarming picture. What was once a safe Labour seat is now a battleground. Reform UK is surging, gaining traction at an unprecedented rate. Some polls even suggest they could win outright, a scenario that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Even if Labour scrapes through with a narrow victory, the damage will have been done. A close race in what should have been an easy win. That's a humiliation in itself. The cracks are spreading inside Labour. The whispers of discontent that once stayed behind closed doors are now creeping into the public eye. MPs who had cautiously backed Starmer are growing restless. Those who had remained neutral are starting to speak up. The idea of Starmer stepping down, once a mere rumour, is now being discussed as a serious possibility. If Labour can't even hold on to its traditional voter base, what hope do they have for the general election? But let's talk about the voters, because that's where this election is truly being decided. There is a deep, simmering anger among the British public. Years of political disappointment, economic hardship, and broken promises have eroded trust in the establishment. The scandals surrounding Starmer's Labour, millions in questionable funding, MPs resigning in disgrace, a party in complete disarray, have only fueled that rage. Reform UK isn't winning support because of its policies, it's winning because it represents something Labour no longer does, the illusion of honesty, of change, of breaking away from the status quo. The working-class voters who once saw Labour as their natural home now feel abandoned. Starmer's Labour is seen as detached, elitist, out of touch with the struggles of ordinary Britons. The donation scandal proved to them that Labour, just like the Tories, is willing to take money from the very industries it claims to oppose. And that stings. It reinforces the belief that no party truly represents them anymore. Meanwhile, Labour's campaign is failing to connect. The usual promises, better wages, a stronger NHS, economic stability, are met with scepticism. Why? Because voters have heard it all before. Labour's words no longer hold weight. Their actions, or rather their failures, speak far louder. And as the election draws closer, that disillusionment is turning into something far worse for Labour: apathy. If people stop believing in a party, they stop voting for it. It's that simple. And right now, there is a very real possibility that lifelong Labour supporters will either stay home on election day or, perhaps even more damning, cast their votes for Reform UK in protest. Starmer himself has become a liability. His leadership style, once seen as pragmatic and sensible, is now viewed as weak and uninspiring. His handling of the recent crises has been nothing short of disastrous. Every time he has been given a chance to show strength, he has instead appeared defensive, evasive, and out of his depth. The media, which once treated him as a serious contender for Prime Minister, is turning on him. Journalists who once gave him the benefit of the doubt are now openly questioning his ability to lead. And what happens if Labour actually loses this by-election? The consequences would be seismic. The calls for Starmer's resignation would become deafening. The internal divisions within Labour would explode into full-blown civil war. The left-wing faction would demand a leadership change, the centrists would panic, and Starmer's remaining allies would struggle to justify why he should remain in power. The pressure would be unbearable. The headlines would be brutal. The message to voters would be clear: Labour isn't ready to govern. If Starmer loses this election, he may as well start writing his resignation speech. Because at that point, his departure will no longer be a question of if, but when. Even if Labour wins by the slimmest of margins, the damage will have been done. A weakened Starmer heading into a general election is a disaster waiting to happen. The momentum will have shifted. The narrative will be set. Labour will be seen as vulnerable, unstable, on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, Reform UK will have cemented itself as a serious political force. A party once dismissed as an afterthought will have made its mark. And from there, the road to the general election becomes even more unpredictable. This by-election is more than just a local contest. It is the defining moment of Keir Starmer's leadership. If he loses, his career is over. If he wins, but barely, the countdown to his downfall begins. The electorate is speaking. The question is Labour ready to listen? Or will it continue down the path of self-destruction, dragging Starmer with it? The answer will come soon enough. But one thing is certain, British politics is about to change forever. The results are in, and they are nothing short of catastrophic for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. What was once a stronghold, a seat Labour could win blindfolded, has been snatched away by Reform UK in a stunning electoral upset. The shockwaves are immediate and unforgiving. The political landscape of the UK has shifted, and Starmer, once seen as the steady hand to guide Labour back to power, is now a man with no future. This is more than just a by-election loss. This is an unambiguous rejection, a devastating signal that Labour under Starmer has lost the trust of the very voters it relies on. Inside Labour HQ, panic has set in. The initial reaction is disbelief, but that quickly turns into raw fear. How did this happen? How did a party that prided itself on being the only true alternative to the Conservative government manage to alienate so many of its own supporters? The numbers don't lie. Voter turnout among traditional Labour strongholds was dismal. The enthusiasm that once defined Labour's grassroots base has evaporated. Reform UK didn't just win because they gained new supporters, they won because Labour's own voters abandoned them. Some stayed home, too disillusioned to even cast a ballot. Others, in what should terrify Labour's leadership, actively switched sides, casting their vote for Reform UK as a direct message of protest. The media frenzy is immediate. Headlines across every major outlet declare the same brutal reality: Labour is in freefall, and Starmer is at the centre of the collapse. Political analysts dissect every mistake, every strategic blunder, every moment that led to this disastrous result. The £4 million scandal, the internal divisions, the discontent among MPs, the loss of working-class support, each factor played a role in Labour's downfall. But what is most damaging is the perception that Starmer himself is the problem. The calls for him to resign, once murmurs among backbenchers, are now deafening roars from within his own ranks. And then the leaks begin. Senior Labour figures, desperate to distance themselves from the wreckage, start briefing journalists anonymously. The picture that emerges is one of total disarray. There are reports of emergency meetings in Westminster, where MPs openly discuss how to force Starmer out before he drags the party down any further. Some are calling for an immediate leadership contest, arguing that Labour needs a fresh face before the general election. Others are even floating the idea of a caretaker leader, someone to steady the ship before a long-term successor is chosen. It is chaos, and everyone knows it. Starmer, meanwhile, looks like a man who has already lost the fight. His public appearances are stiff, his response is robotic. The once confident leader who promised to rebuild Labour into a formidable force now seems paralysed, unsure of his next move. His team insists that he has no intention of stepping down, that he will reflect on the result and work to regain trust. But nobody believes it. The pressure is simply too intense. The party is bleeding, and the only way to stop it, as more and more MPs are saying publicly, is for Starmer to go. The breaking point comes when even his most loyal allies begin to turn against him. Figures who once defended him to the bitter end now refuse to speak in his favour. Some remain silent, unwilling to attach themselves to a sinking ship. Others, in a final act of political self-preservation, start subtly signalling their support for new leadership. It is the ultimate betrayal, but it is also entirely predictable. In politics, loyalty only lasts as long as a leader's ability to win. And Starmer, quite simply, can no longer win. The resignation, when it finally comes, is as humiliating as it is inevitable. The press conference is a disaster. Starmer, flanked by a few remaining allies, delivers a strained, emotionless speech. He insists that he is proud of what he has achieved, that he still believes in Labour's vision, that he is stepping aside for the good of the party. But no one is buying it. The reality is written all over his face: he has been forced out. The party he once led has turned against him. His time is up. And now, the real battle begins. With Starmer gone, Labour is plunged into a leadership vacuum. The factions that have been quietly warring behind the scenes are now preparing to fight in the open. The centrists, desperate to hold on to power, are pushing for a candidate who can maintain stability. The left, seeing an opportunity to reclaim the party, is rallying around their own contenders. The infighting is vicious, and it threatens to tear Labour apart even further. But the real question is whether the party can recover from this at all. This by-election loss was not just about Starmer, it was about Labour itself. The public has lost faith. The voters who once trusted Labour to represent them are now looking elsewhere. Reform UK has capitalised on this, but the damage runs deeper. It is not just about one seat. It is about a fundamental shift in British politics, a sign that Labour's dominance is no longer guaranteed. The road ahead is uncertain. A new leader may emerge, but will they be able to rebuild what has been lost? Can Labour regain the trust of the voters who abandoned them? Or is this the beginning of an even deeper decline? One thing is certain, British politics will never be the same again.